We are happy to be joined by the author, Brad Edmondson. So nice to have you. Welcome.
Thank you.
This didn't start out as a book, did it?
No.
How did this happen?
I'm an independent journalist, and I was asked if I'd be interested in doing oral history interviews with the people who set up the APA. And I was really happy to get the assignment. And originally, I just did my background research and went up with a tape recorder and occasionally a video camera and had these wonderful conversations of 1 hour or more with these fascinating people. By the time it was done, I had 1,500 pages of transcripts and hours and hours and hours of tape. And but the grant ran out, and I just put it in a filing cabinet for 10 years.
How did it end up coming out of that filing cabinet and into the pages of this book?
Well, you know, it was mocking me from the filing cabinet, from the edge of my office, saying, Brad, when are you going to do something about this? Nobody knew about the project. So in 2017, I went to the Adirondack Experience Museum and said, would you be interested in being the curator of this material? And they said, yeah, but also we've been looking for a way to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Adirondack Park Agency. So why don't we fundraise for a documentary, and while we're at it, we'll put on a conference and an online exhibit and maybe some other things. And by the time those plans took shape, I thought, well, I should probably write a book. So that's how the book came about.
And we will be happy to air the documentary coming up in a few months here in Mountain Lake PBS.
Yeah, it's coming together really well.
So the book looks at this bold idea, and you interviewed many of these key players, these pioneers who had this vision to protect the Adirondacks, to keep the Adirondack Park from experiencing what Vermont and other states did at the same time, being developed, and in many cases overdeveloped, with thousands of vacation homes and resorts in these rural areas. And so this core group had this vision of taking action.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of saying it. And it wasn't that vacation homes were a bad thing per se. It was the way that they were being proposed, where corporations were buying big tracts of rural land where there were no zoning controls at all, and also no infrastructure at the town and village level to take care of the houses once they were put up. And then the houses in those subdivisions would be built in a haphazard way, and they'd create huge zoning problems and also visual problems for the towns and villages. So there were a number of different people who were alarmed at the prospect of this happening inside the Adirondack Park. Environmentalists were alarmed by it. Hiking groups that sort of became environmentalists were alarmed by it. And planners were also alarmed by it. And these were the very groups that had the ear of Governor Nelson Rockefeller in the late 60s and early 70s.
So why did this happen? What was happening in the mid to late 60s that prompted this?
There were several things that were coming together. One was the environmental movement. If you weren't around in the late 60s and early 70s, it's hard really to explain the suddenness and the power with which the environmental movement just blew up. And in 1970, if you wanted to get reelected, particularly in New York, and you needed the voters of New York City to get reelected, you had to have strong environmental positions. Earth Day in 1970 was this massive, almost an evangelical gathering of concern for the health of the planet and concern about air and water pollution. So I think Governor Rockefeller was also the right person to bring this idea forward, because he always described himself as a problem solver. He loved to build things, and he loved to get smart people together into a room and give them a complex problem and see what kind of solutions they worked out. He loved study commissions. He appointed 13 of them just in the year that he appointed the temporary study commission. So Rockefeller was the right governor. The environmental movement was really coming up and peaking just as the Adirondack Park Agency bill was introduced into the legislature.
Was the commission put together in a way by Nelson Rockefeller for his brother Lawrence.
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to interview Lawrence Rockefeller. He was not able to grant an interview. So I never got the chance to ask him that directly. And Nelson, of course, died in 1979. But several of the people who were close to the process said that, yes, essentially, Nelson Rockefeller appointed this study commission under pressure from several groups, but notably under pressure from Lawrence, who was his best friend, as well as his younger brother. And Lawrence, of course, was passionate about creating parks. So Lawrence wanted the Adirondacks to be a national park and had proposed that in 1967. And it was just, it was a non-starter. Everybody hated that idea. But everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people agreed with Lawrence at the same time that the Adirondacks were under threat and something needed to happen. So in order to ameliorate the environmental community and also please his younger brother, his best friend, Rockefeller appointed this commission. And the interesting thing about the commission that I discovered just from digging into the archival record was that there was sort of a private fight on the commission between the people who favored the idea of a national park style development for the Adirondacks and the people who were passionately devoted to the forever wild Adirondacks. And basically the forever wild people won.
Though supporting the national park would have probably supported allowing more motorized vehicles, allowing
Correct.
more tourists to come in and have access to the forest preserve and other wilderness areas.
Exactly. The forever wild clause in the Constitution, which bars the cutting of a single tree on state-owned land in the Adirondacks without a statewide referendum, that would have gone away had the core of the Adirondacks been transferred to the National Park Service. And then the National Park Service would have developed the high peaks and the central lakes of the Adirondacks and so forth, national park style, which meant parking areas, snack bars, beaches, and giving the maximum number of people access to the resource, which was really not the Forever Wild Clause's idea.
And which was something the Rockefellers had done elsewhere. Acadia National Park in Maine.
Jackson Hole National Park, Redwoods National Park, Virgin Islands National Park. I mean, the Rockefellers were probably the most important private donors to the national park system and had an instrumental role in the creation of at least a half a dozen parks. And from Lawrence's point of view, the Adirondacks were a real prize because not only were they national park quality, they were also within a day's drive of 1/6 of the U.S. population.
Did that put him at odds with other members of the Temporary Study Commission?
Oh, very much so. In fact, one of the things that Peter Payne told me when I interviewed him was that Lawrence was a family friend of the Paynes. He was a classmate of Peter Payne Sr. And Lawrence came up to the Payne farm to do some grouse hunting and visit once when this Adirondack National Park idea was basically being battered about. And Lawrence was kind of baffled by it. Why doesn't the environmental community support this idea? And Peter, who was 31 years old at the time, but was then as now perfectly willing to state his opinion to anybody who asked, said, well, Lawrence, it's because the Forever Wild Clause is beloved to people in New York State. They don't want it to change, and in fact, we think it's better than the National Park Service.
And it wouldn't change under the Temporary Study Commission. That would stay intact.
The recommendations that the Temporary Study Commission produced at the beginning of 1971 basically were to strengthen the protections of the Forever Wild Clause on the state land by creating a system of wilderness areas. And in fact, the wilderness protections in the Adirondacks are stronger than they are under federal rules because of the Forever Wild Clause. But the real thing that the Temporary Study Commission did that was truly revolutionary was they recommended the establishment of a state agency which would control the development of 3.5 million acres of private land.
Zoning. They would zone all of that land taking that control away from 100+ towns and villages that
Yeah.
normally
Yes.
would decide things like zoning and
Yes, zoning is ordinarily a town and village level responsibility. And there's a tradition in New York, a constitutionally protected principle called home rule, which is that certain functions, zoning being one of them, are usually the provenance of town and village governments. The Adirondack Park Agency was really a wild idea for several reasons, but one of them was that the state came in and said, no, unfortunately, to the 101 towns and villages of the Adirondacks, you can't handle the challenges that this park is facing. So the state is going to install standards, and we hope that you will live up to them someday, but these are the new standards. And the local people, of course, didn't like that one bit.
they revolted.
They did.
Government leaders thought it was overreach on the part of the state. Did they, as a result, were they reluctant to go along with it?
You know, that's an interesting thing, too. A lot of the people I interviewed who were local officials at the time, and a lot of the people on the APA side, in the years after the APA was instituted, said that the meetings between the APA and local officials, the private meetings, were often a lot more cordial and cooperative than the public meetings. And the local officials would frequently be appreciative or supportive or at least understanding of what the APA was trying to do when they were in their private office with the doors closed. But then they would go to a public meeting that night and just rip the APA up and down. And the reason was that it was the people inside the Adirondack Park were so insulted by the idea of the APA that really you couldn't get reelected if you publicly supported it inside the blue line.
If there was so much opposition to this, how in the world did it pass?
It really threaded the needle. You know, it very easily might not have passed. But there were several things that happened where the timing was just perfect. The original law in 1971 was introduced in April, which was also Earth Day. And I don't know if you recall, there was a very famous commercial called The Crying Indian.
Sure.
A PSA where, you know, the Indian with a tear running down his... That came out about 2 weeks before the bill was released. And people absolutely went nuts. You know, this passion for protecting the environment was at a fever pitch. Then 2 years later, when the private land plan was released, the APA said, look, this is just a ridiculous amount of work. We're never going to get to it all. Can't we have another year to do this so that people can really digest the plan and we can do it right? And Rockefeller said, no, you've got to turn it in for a 1973 legislative session or we're not going to consider it. So he insisted that the bill be considered in 1973 for a couple of reasons. One was that it was not a statewide election year, so that it wouldn't become a statewide political issue. But the other was that I think Rockefeller might already have had his eye on the door. He announced to his staff that he was resigning as governor to run for president for the 4th time, 3 months after he signed the private land plan into law. So he basically abandoned the Adirondack Park Agency as soon as he created it.
So in May of 1971, the Adirondack Park Agency Act passed, which created the APA. And then the APA had to go about coming up with the 2 documents, the master plan for the state land and then the land use document for all the private land. And that took 2 years, and that's what was voted on in 1973.
Correct.
And leading up to that, in late 1972 and early 1973, were these very contentious hearings that were held around the Adirondack Park and beyond. And again, they heard so much opposition from people at these hearings. Was there surprise on the part of the commission members and others that it continued on and that the plans were approved?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that the Adirondack Park Agency Board was at all surprised that people in the park were angry. In the minutes, it's pretty clear that they knew they were going to get put through the ringer no matter what they proposed. I think there was a great deal of concern on the board's part that the process was moving so quickly and that a lot of questions hadn't been answered by the time they had to release the document to the public. But no, they weren't particularly surprised. They knew that a storm was coming.
Even as all of this was happening, there were some major developments on the drawing board.
Yes.
Throughout the Adirondacks, thousands of proposed second homes at that time.
Yeah, and it was really the specter of these enormous second home, vacation home developments that more than anything else pushed the APA into law.
Revolutionary at the time. Is it still held up today as a model?
Not so much, no. I think the way the Adirondack Park Agency was put in place was very much a function of its time. I don't think it could happen again in the same way. And one of the interesting things now is that environmentalists are actually angrier at the Adirondack Park Agency today than developers are. You know, there's still a lot of grumbling and grousing about all of the red tape, but really the people who are hardest on the APA now are the hardcore environmentalists.